I think this chapter does a couple of things. It, first of all, brings out very strongly the idea that underneath the interactions that we see, there are usually invisible forces. And just knowing that is very helpful. Then practicing our awareness of what those forces are is even more helpful and often gives us a capacity in conflict that we didn't know we had. And Marshall Rosenberg and other people have shown that really almost all conflict is driven by the need to get fulfillment of certain basic needs. And these basic needs are not in competition. If I get what I really need, not what I want, it won't be anything that I won't have to take it from you, and it won't injure you in any way. On the contrary. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that it is a struggle to change our frame of awareness sometimes so that this consciousness can come out. And here's where the story of Nurse Joan Black works so very well. Somebody comes bursting into the ER where she's working, followed by a woman with a gun. And instead of freaking out, instead of panicking, partly because she is a nurse in her operating room, she goes over to that person, holds the gun down, and calms her down, talks her out of the situation, mostly by saying, yeah, I've had troubles like this too. So 2 points here. A person who is in a state of rage against others is in a very narrow box which separates them from those others. And if you, with a minute you say, yeah, I've been there too, that frame opens a little bit. You're not so isolated. The minute you break out of that isolation, you're on your way towards the recognition of unity, which dissolves and evaporates conflict. And the other thing I want to say about it is that it's a very fulfilling and healthful situation. So it may seem counterintuitive at first, but as St. Augustine says in the chapter, it's our nature. Our nature is to desire unity as far as we possibly can with basically with all that lives. So when we feel hostility, we feel that unity is being torn. And when we can reconnect it, even just in our own mind, before we get into the question of behavior, we feel a healing. And like all violence, more and more as time goes on, we're learning to regard violence as a form of trauma. And the really deep insight there is to realize that it's more traumatic for the person doing the violence than for the victim of it. And we have a concept, I don't remember whether it actually comes up in this chapter or not, called perpetration-induced traumatic stress. That was a going term for it in those days. Now we call it moral injury. And then I go into the etymology of the word ahimsa, which has some really deep wisdom in it, especially in that root hims, take away the prefix which means not, and the long A at the end, which just means hello, I am a noun, and you get HI nasal S, hence. And that comes from a root hun. This is in Sanskrit now, classical Sanskrit. And hun means to strike, nor or to slay. You know, the character who's in one of the epics says, Nahantavyum, I am not to be slain by you. Nahantavyosmis te, I am not to be slain by you. So then the question is, how do you get from hun, slay or hit, to hims? And it's what linguists call a desiderative, meaning that it's not the act of striking. The word does not necessarily refer to the act of striking, but to the intention to strike, to the desire to strike, the desiderative. desideratum, we'd say in English. Again, that shows up the inside of the ancient vocabulary. And then in the further in the chapter, two models are developed. Each of them a set of three. One is from Kenneth Boulding, is three faces of power: threat power, economic power, or what he calls exchange power, and integrative power, which is the least studied. But in threat power, we say, do what I want, or I'll do something you don't want. In exchange power, we're a little bit less in opposition. Say, if you give me something I want, I'll give you something you want. Give me a latte, I'll give you $5. And then finally, integrative power, which is subtler and more powerful. And it says, I am going to be truthful. I am going to be real. And that will automatically, on some level, bring us closer together. It might not be to where you'd notice it, but it'll be the background, the platform on which you can then create conflict resolution. So that was one model, the three faces of power: threat, exchange, and integrative. And of course, nonviolence is the integrative power, and it's very good to show that it has power for the reason that St. Augustine indicated. We want to be in connection with others just as far as we possibly can. The other model has to do with a concept of framing, which I find very helpful and very powerful. And that is, in what framework do we see another person or thing or situation? And the Joan Black story, again, is a good example of this. In her frame of reference, being a nurse on duty, she saw the distraught person as a person that needed help. Now, if she'd been out on the street, or if she had been in a policeman's uniform, she would have seen that person as a threat, as someone that had to be neutralized. The three lenses that I talk about, and I borrow that term lenses from a man named Howard Zehr, wrote a book called Changing Lenses, is the three are moral, to see things as a sin; medical, to see things as a disease; and finally, educational, to see things as a kind of ignorance. The moral model is in many ways the worst. Once you think that a person is immoral, you've exiled them from the human environment, and that's when you feel you have to eliminate the person and not just their behavior. The medical model is a good step up from that, as we saw with the story of Joan Black, but then still there's a kind of stigma that attaches to the idea of disease. To say to a person, you're sick, is not always very polite. But then to recognize, as Swami Ramdas says, and he's the one that I quote, that violence is a kind of ignorance, and ignorance can be cured by learning. So those were basically the points of the story, those two models, the Boulding model and the three lens model. And behind that, that there is an underlying force present in every one of us, which manifests as a desire to be in connection with others, and that we can learn to, we should never forget that is there, and we can learn to use it to adjudicate conflict. And the way that we do that is mostly by reframing the person so they're not immoral, they're not sick, but there's a way that you can help them understand something. That's it. So that in a nonviolent interaction, when you use integrative power, you're really saying not just that we'll both be closer, but that in being closer, we will both be closer to the truth. We will both learn something. Now, there are other details and anecdotes in the chapter, but I think those are really the main takeaways, the structural takeaways.